least see the camera on it. Okay, I'm live in it. Good. Good. Just wanted to make sure I could get it started. I would have not preferred to have to just go with the one Zoom feed this time. Okay, everybody. Well, thanks again for being here. Appreciate all your attendance as we get into the last few weeks of our semester. Today, we're going to continue to develop more of our notes on Chapter 9, the chapter that has to do with ethics. And this is the second of 3 lectures on the ethics topic. We'll finish this out on Tuesday next week, and then we will have 2 review sessions after that, next Thursday and then Tuesday following. And then in 2 weeks from today, the 16th, is when you'll have your final exam. Don't forget that your 4th homework is due next Thursday, anytime before midnight on that day, so as late as 11:59 on that day. And you just send me it as an email attachment whenever you're ready. That's the media analysis, critical analysis of news media. And if you needed to see further details on that, if you weren't here maybe last time, just go ahead and you can check the announcement that I sent through Canvas to the class. Okay, so good to see you guys and hope you're all doing well. Go ahead and feel free to leave a comment of whatever kind in either chat, just to keep a record of your attendance in there. No big deal, but just leave the comment, drop a comment if you can. Okay, and as always, if you ever have any kind of questions or any other things that you need to ask or anything else, let me know. Zoe over there on YouTube, I know I hadn't yet gotten back to my emails, but did you ever message me? Zoe there? Just wanted to quickly ask while I see you here in the live chat. Okay, you had a few questions about homework 4, Kelvin. Let me know, what questions? Also, Zoe, can you hear me? Can you respond to me? If you can, I would love to know. I hope you're not just saying hello and then that's it, you're gone. Okay, yes, you just sent me it. Okay, perfect. It was about that quiz that you had tried to send. You sent me something in a format called GDoc. There's no way to open that. I've tried everything, of like every app that exists, so I can't unlock your file. You're gonna have to resend it in a different file format. That's what I was asking. Kelvin, do you have questions about homework 4? If you do, let me know. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Zoe. That's great. I'm happy to have that settled. Okay, well then, let's just keep going. And Kelvin, if you do have those questions, just let me know. It says, do we have to write an overall view for the stories, or do we have to go straight to analyze the fallacies? Yeah, you have to, it's not just about fallacies. It's about everything in the class, like all the course concepts. So you could put fallacies, rhetoric, different examples of like, I don't know, cognitive perceptual errors, just any course topics at all that you can link to the information provided in the different news stories. So fallacies are part of it, but yeah, you should also have kind of like an overall view of each one. And you do have to include the timestamp. So hold on a minute, clips and images. There's no images at all. There's no clips either. You're just the one that watches the news, and you just submit documents to me. The documents are just written. The documents just show the name of the stories with the amount of time was given to each one in a sort of table of contents at the beginning. And then after that, you have a written report, 2 pages of prose, where you speak to me about what your critical analysis was of the overall content, quality, news value of the broadcast and the individual stories. So if they have commercials, no, don't include those. The commercials are not part of this assignment. That one was for the 3rd homework. So in this case, you're just writing on the content presented in the newscast itself. Okay, so those are good questions. It is a critical analysis essay, so that's all you got to do. You got to try to find areas to critique and spot any kind of effort to shape the viewer's perspective in a way that's not based on reason. If there's any kind of fallacies, rhetoric, editing tactics, bias, then that should be mentioned. Okay, well, good. Thank you guys so much. I'm glad I could get to those questions. So let's continue then with our work right now. We're moving on to the second lecture of Chapter 9. Chapter 9 is all about ethics. So let me start off with just some summary of some of the material that we had on Tuesday, and then I'll pick up from there where we left off. So first of all, we are now studying ethics. Ethics is the study of morality and moral concepts. Moral concepts are things like good and bad, right and wrong, just and unjust, moral and immoral, virtue and vice, and in general, how a person should or should not act, morally speaking. Whenever we engage in judgments about what actions are right or wrong, good or bad, we're engaged, therefore, in moral reasoning. And sometimes we make moral judgments. Sometimes we are subject to moral judgments. But it's a key feature of the human condition, just being able at all to entertain moral questions and to think about them, unlike other non-human animals. We said that there were 3 different categories of actions in ethics. Can anybody tell me any of those? What are some of the different types of actions within ethics? We have morally blank, blank, and blank. Let's see if anyone can just state a few of those concepts. Morally permissible, very good. To the contrary, there's morally, what else? Yes, morally impermissible. And then morally obligatory. All right, correct. So like morally impermissible actions are actions that are wrong, that are not okay to do morally. Whether or not people do them, they shouldn't be doing them. So these are things like killing, lying, cheating, stealing, rape, torture, genocide, a whole bunch of bad things that unfortunately people can and sometimes, in fact, do. Um, on the other hand, there are morally permissible actions, and those are actions that are not wrong and they are okay to do. So that encompasses a pretty wide range. It could be giving to charity. It could be helping someone prepare for their exam. It could be chewing gum, walking down the street, riding a bike. It's all kinds of stuff, all the things that you're entitled to do morally and that are not blameworthy actions. Some of them are going to create a positive impact, like doing things that are beneficial to others. Others don't really have much positive impact, but they're also not harmful and they're not outside of the scope of what you're entitled to do morally. So that's morally permissible. And then there's morally obligatory actions. Those are the ones that you must do, and it would be wrong not to do them. So I don't know, providing care for a child that you have taken custody of, paying for a service like food after it's already been consumed at the end, um, keeping a promise. And of course, we also said there's a logical connection between the first and the third moral categories because not doing what is impermissible is always an obligation. So you have a moral obligation to not lie, cheat, kill, or whatever. And the non-performance of a moral obligation is impermissible. So it's wrong to not keep your promises or to not take care of your children or to not pay the bill. Okay. From there, I guess we talked a little bit about different types of values that people have. We talked about the difference between moral and non-moral values. Moral values are values that are good for you, but they're also beneficial to others, and they're even considered good for their own sake. So think of things like justice, forgiveness, compassion, altruism. Those are things that are good both to those who are the one that you show the value towards, but also to you yourself. And even when they don't necessarily reach a desired outcome or a productive goal, we still think it's a good thing for a person to exhibit these values just in and of themselves. So that's why we say they're good for their own sake. On the other hand, there are non-moral values. Some call them instrumental values. And those are values that are goal-oriented and they're only desired as a means to an end. So fame, wealth, popularity, prestige, those are values for sure. But they're not desired for the sake of what they can do for others per se, but rather how they can promote your own self-interest and happiness. Notice that these values are only cared about as a means to the real goal, which is happiness. If we didn't think that the wealth or fame or popularity would make a person happy, then they wouldn't be desired because they're only seen as valuable as an instrument to get us to those other higher goals. Now, the book mentions, and I think it's fair to say that we should have a good balance of both. It's not like some of these values are unimportant. We should have a good, healthy mix of moral and non-moral values because ultimate happiness and satisfaction comes from the moral values over and beyond just the non-moral ones. Okay, I guess from there we talked about the conscience, right? And so the conscience is this internal, sort of inborn source of knowledge about what's right and wrong. It helps to guide us to the right moral decisions and actions. It's the it's the part of us that would make us feel badly if we had done something bad, like in the case where a person feels a guilty conscience, or it might be the part of us that impels us to do the right thing, even when we're tempted to do otherwise, because our conscience doesn't sit well with us if we do the wrong thing. We said that it's innate, but it could be nurtured, as like, for example, the ability of humans to learn language. So if it's not properly cultivated in early life and in your moral education, it might not fully take form. Um, we talked about moral sentiments, which are emotions that alert us to moral situations and cause us to want to do what's right. Our conscience helps to reveal these moral sentiments to us. In that mix, we talked about compassion, helper's high, um, moral outrage, and the difference between moral outrage and resentment. We also talked about guilt and shame and how those are also capable of being different, right? And like guilt is a bad feeling that comes from doing a moral wrong, but shame is a bad feeling that comes from violating a social norm. And it's possible, therefore, to feel shame without guilt if you do something that's like socially awkward, but it's not necessarily an immoral act. Okay. And I think that's it, right? Is that correct, guys? Is that where we kind of left off with the discussion of guilt and shame? Let me know. I think that's my memory anyway. Okay, pretty much. So good. We're going to pick up then from there to the next section in the chapter 9. The next section of chapter 9 talks about the development of moral reasoning in a person's life over their lifetime. This is a question that's actually been studied by certain psychologists, including this man. So I'll give you his name, Lawrence Kohlberg. He lived from 1927 to 1987, and he was a Harvard psychologist. Okay. And this Harvard psychologist named Lawrence Kohlberg studied the concept or the process of moral development. And what he thought is that there were three general stages of moral development. So, three stages or phases that a person can pass through as they go from the most immature level of moral thinking to the most nuanced and sophisticated. So, we have got, therefore, three stages of moral development. And we recognize Kohlberg for being responsible for some of these ideas about the different stages. He thought that these stages of moral development were sort of universal to the human condition, that all people basically go through the same series of stages, and in that sense, he thinks it can be found in all cultures because he studied this process not just in like Western cultures, but all around the world, Eastern cultures, indigenous places, native cultures. And he thought that he could identify general patterns that are found in all. So, based on his research, he sort of distills it down into three major stages of moral development or moral progress. So, we're going to go and talk about what each one is and what the difference between them are. So, the first stage is what he calls the preconventional stage of moral development. Okay. Preconventional. And this preconventional stage of moral development is defined in this way. So this is like the most basic and primordial, immature stage of moral development, the kind of moral outlook that you have to think in like children or I guess relatively unsophisticated adults. This would be when a person thinks that morality is all just about avoiding punishment for yourself. So let me give you that definition. Okay. So if you're in the pre-conventional stage of moral development, you recognize the existence of moral rules and stuff, but you only abide by them out of concern for what might happen to you if you get caught, found out, or held accountable. So people in the pre-conventional stage of moral reasoning, they don't really think about why it's wrong to do something for the sake of anybody else. Like they might not steal, but it's not because they recognize the validity of property rights or that someone is entitled to retain their property. Um, it's rather because they're worried that if they were to be discovered having stolen, then penalties or sanctions could be brought down upon them. So in the case where, yeah, it's kind of just fear, it's worry or concern for transgressing the moral rules in a way that might get you in trouble, get you grounded, or maybe if you're a little older, get you in trouble with the law or with certain kinds of authorities. So these people, they don't actually recognize the basis for why something is right or wrong, aside from its impact on them. And so it's kind of a little bit more of a self-centered viewpoint on morality. The individual is only inhibited from the bad things because they're concerned about the punishments that might happen. Now, there's a little like set of diagrams that are written in the book that try to give you a visual to help make this more easy to remember. And so at stage 1, they give us this little visual image. 2 circles, one larger than the other. And it's like this. In the book, you'd see this. But the circle that represents me is smaller. No, I meant to do it the opposite way. I just wrote the wrong word. Strike that. Just transpose the words. This is what I meant to do. Okay, thank you. Notice that the circle which represents me is much larger than the one that stands for others. And that is because the priority that one has when they're in the pre-conventional stage is just me, me, me. Like I'm worried about my own liability to penalties or sanctions. So it's a way of abiding by moral principles, but it's only due to the concern that you have, the fear, as you might say, Kay, of punishments. So let me say what the book has to say on that point, and then we'll continue from there. Okay, yeah, so here in this book, okay, according to Harvard psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg, people advance through distinct stages in the development of their moral reasoning capabilities. These stages are transcultural, that is, they are found in every culture of the world. Each new stage represents increased proficiency in critical thinking skill and greater satisfaction with your moral decisions. Kohlberg identified 3 levels of moral development. In the first, which he called the preconventional stage, morality is defined egotistically in terms of oneself. People at this level expect others to treat them morally, but generally do not treat other people with moral respect unless doing so benefits them. And it says, most, though not all, people outgrow the preconventional stages by high school. Most criminals are at this stage, and nearly half of all crimes are committed by young people between the ages of 15 and 24. So I guess, yeah, it's like the criminal mind is probably a little bit more given to this way of thinking about morality because they're more willing to act on the temptation to transgress the law if they think that they could get away with it. So the fear of getting caught is what motivates people to stay in line with morality on this moral perspective. But if a person thought they had a realistic chance to avoid that, then they would be willing to commit the crimes because they don't see the wrongness of the crime in and of itself, apart from the penalties to them. Of course, if you keep growing, developing, gaining more experience, gaining more maturity, then you might make it up to the second stage of moral development, and I'm sure most all of you have. So the second stage they call conventional. Okay, the conventional stage of moral reasoning. So like what you're seeing here is it's pre-conventional, then regular conventional. The conventional stage is when a person starts to think about morality in terms of fitting in to the social norms and standards of their society. So that's what it is, and let me write it here. So conventional stage. One wants to fit into the norms and conventions of their society. And that's another different basis for wanting to follow moral rules. At the conventional stage, the person's major primary motive is this. They want to fit in. They want to not stand out from what's considered normal or conventional in their society. So it's going from like fear of uh, penalty to now desire for conformity or to fit in. So at the conventional stage of moral reasoning, a person will, follow the moral rules, but it's only because they think that it's the norm, the standard that they should be following, given um, their desire to fit in. They may start to judge themselves according to the standards of their peers, and then they may also start to judge themselves according to the standards of their society. Okay, you say, I feel most people stay or accept this stage and sometimes stay in this even for the rest of their lives for their own happiness and following the crowd. Yes, it's true. And the book talks about that. They say that there's only 10% of Americans that make it to the third and highest stage. And by the time most people are, young adults, college age, they've made it to this conventional stage, but it's hard for some people to make progress beyond it. Another diagram is given for this stage, stage 2, and it's just the reverse of the first one. So now the circle that stands for others is the bigger of the two, because it's all about fitting in to the norms and the expectations of society now. So the individual thinks, what I want to do is be a part of this bigger group. I don't want to stand outside. I don't want to be isolated, alienated, ostracized from the group norms, the social norms, and so on. And Gabriel, sounds like the same thing except for fear of social ridicule. Yes, in a way, they're both less than fully mature because it's a desire for some kind of status that either won't be penalized or will be recognized. Let me go ahead and read from the book what it says here. As it says here, people at the conventional stages look to others for moral guidance. Earning the approval of others and conforming to group norms are especially important to people at stage 3. The first stage at stage 2. For example, Lindy England, one of the American guards at the Abu Ghraib prison scandal in Iraq at her court-martial, stated in her defense that she chose to do what my friends wanted me to do. The judge rejected that plea. So she completed her 3-year prison sentence, and she continues to blame others for the scandal. Most high school seniors and college freshmen are in this stage of moral development. The stage is associated with the first stage of cognitive development, in which students believe that there are right and wrong answers and that those in authority know the right answers. There's one thing actually I kind of forgot to write about the stage 2. In case you want to get a clearer sense of it, it's a desire for approval, not necessarily fear of punishment. And they mentioned that the person wants to be recognized as like a good boy or a nice girl. So that's part of the like motivation too. In stage 2, now that's their language, so I'm putting it in like scare quotes. So just additional detail there. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of overlap in all the concepts, of course. There's a sort of convergence of ideas around many of these things that we're talking about. But now we're talking about the moral aspects, particularly, not just intellectually, because you can have a hard time coming up with a view on what's true and false, which is just intellectual development, cognitive development. But there's also the ability to make judgments about what's right and wrong, which is on the moral side of the spectrum. That's why we're emphasizing this. So in the stage 2, you want to be seen with the right kind of social approval or approbation. This stage is associated with the first stage of cognitive development, in which students believe that there are right and wrong answers and authorities know the right answers. Eventually, you can substitute the norms and laws of the culture for the peer group norms, sometimes called cultural relativism. The majority of American adults are at this stage. Rather than thinking through decisions about moral issues, they adopt a prevailing view. The mere fact that everyone agrees with them confirms for them that they are right. Okay, now finally, if you go further and you make as much moral progress as you can, then you'll make it all the way out to that third and highest stage of moral development, and that they call the post-conventional stage. Okay. So third stage, post-conventional. Okay. So in the third stage of moral development, you're at the post-conventional stage. So the sequence goes like pre-conventional, regular conventional, post-conventional, like before, during, and after. And the post-conventional stage now is where you think that there are universal moral principles. So one adopts universal moral principles, and they will sometimes will have these moral principles conflict with the conventional view of society. So one second, just got to get this pasted up. Okay. So the post-conventional stage. At that stage, one adopts universal moral principles. And these principles that they then adopt will sometimes lead to conclusions that differ from the conventional views of your society. So imagine that you were a person living during the time of slavery in this country, and you were morally opposed to the institution, even though it was widely practiced at the time in society. So the prevailing view of society at that time would have been that this is a legitimate and justified institution or something like that. But imagine that you hold this universal moral principle that human beings should not be treated as property. They should not be bought and sold, traded as though they were mere commodities, because that's disrespectful of human dignity. And then you might have been a person who advocated for the abolition of slavery, standing against, let's say, the status quo of the time. It's only a person who has post-conventional moral reasoning that can say that, because they're the sort of person who says, here's what is regarded in the mainstream of my society as right or good, but I have a different view because I have principles that conflict with the system itself. So people who can criticize the status quo, people who can say that there are aspects of what everyone takes for granted that are wrong, have got the post-conventional moral development going on. And here's what it says in the book about it. At the post-conventional stage of moral reasoning, people recognize that social conventions need to be justified. The fact that something is the law does not make it moral or just. Instead, moral decisions should be based on universal moral principles such as justice, compassion, and mutual respect. So if you had thought that women should be given a right to vote because you believed in the equality of all people, back in, like, say, 1910 in this country, when the Constitution hadn't yet ratified the right of women in this country to vote, then you would have been thinking post-conventionally about morality, seeing that this is the norm of society, but finding the whole system itself to be flawed on moral grounds. And there's a little more discussion in the book here. They talk about how the stage of moral development that you're at can make a difference in terms of how you might act. So researchers have found that only 9% of people in the first stage, but 38% of people at the second stage would offer help to somebody who appeared to be suffering from the side effects of a drug. But 100% of subjects at the third stage did offer such assistance, and less than 10% of American adults reached this post-conventional level of moral reasoning. People at lower levels of moral reasoning tend to come up with simple-minded solutions to problems, and when those solutions don't work or backfire, they become confused and frustrated. People outgrow their old ways of thinking when it becomes inadequate for resolving the more complicated problems and issues that they encounter in life. And so movement to a higher stage of development is often triggered by new experiences that conflict with your previous worldview. And in terms of these little diagrams, circles and such that we've been showing, there's one more for the third case, stage 3. And all that is that it brings them into equilibrium with each other so that they're the same size. So stage 3, I think, yeah, that's roughly the same size. So why they're the same size now? Because at the post-conventional level of moral reasoning, you do take by way of advisement and consideration the views of society, the prevailing wisdom of the consensus, but you have it balanced against your own independent judgment, such that this can sometimes overrule, in your view, the common or the conventional stance. So that's moral development in the course of a person's life. And sorry, getting over here. Let me say one more thing about the whole moral development stuff. if you go into the book, you would notice one thing that, in fact, they try to divide each of the three stages into two subparts. So it's like in the actual book, it's like stage one, subcategory one and two, stage two, subcategory one and two. So they actually kind of have like 6 points: stage one, part one and two, stage two, part one and two, stage three, part one and two. In my view, though, that was unnecessarily complex, and I don't think it really added much to the overall discussion of the concept. So I'm just holding us accountable for the three main stages, not like the two halves of each one that are mentioned in the more detailed description given in the book. Because in some cases, I didn't think that there was enough difference between the two subpoints to justify wholly different definitions and concepts. So for us, anyway, it's pre-conventional, conventional, post-conventional. Starting off by thinking morality is just, I don't want to get in trouble. Moving on to thinking morality is all about, I want to fit in and I want to be approved of. And then getting to the third stage where you're willing to say, you know what, I have my own moral principles. And I think that sometimes they're going to lead me to conclusions that are contrary to the prevailing wisdom. Okay. So in college, people grow and develop a lot from the early childhood experiences that they had in their, parents' household or in their family home. It's a crisis for some because you start to have your worldviews challenged and sometimes disrupted by the interaction with other people, with different assumptions, with your teachers, with the subjects that you're learning in school. And the book talks about how over the course of a college education, a person actually develops a little more nuance and complexity in the way they morally reason. When it makes sense to draw a third largest circle labeled your own moral value. Well, you mean in the third case there, Gabriel? It's like the priority, though, between your judgment and the judgments of society become a little bit balanced. Being able to overrule the prevailing wisdom doesn't mean that it has no weight at all. So it's not as if the person who's at that post-conventional level will consistently and across the board deviate from moral common sense of the majority. It's after all, often the case that we have good collective moral judgments. It's just that the possibility exists for you to have a difference of view. Go with the flow, but keep in mind where the flow takes you would be a fair way to put it, I suppose. Yes. I mean, I don't know if it's not exactly going with the flow, because again, when your own judgment contradicts the so-called flow, you'll be willing to take a step outside of it. But for the most part, with some exceptions, you may find agreement with a lot of these things. Having your own judgment doesn't mean that it's always a disagreement judgment, but it holds open the possibility that when you think you're right and the majority's wrong, that you're going to stand your ground and hold to your own principles. So I hope I'm not trying to make it overly complex. It's just that some people will, when they have fully developed moral outlook on reality, they might say, the majority's wrong. The status quo is wrong. People believe in my society in slavery, and I just don't agree with that. Now, if there were no post-conventional moral reasoners, then there would never be moral progress because people would just defer to each other and would never take a step outside to question the legitimacy of an existing scheme of action. So it's actually quite important for people to be able to hold and argue in favor of clear moral principles. But anyway, yeah, so about the college stuff, the book talks about some examples where they've studied the moral reasoning of people at different stages in college. And so here it says, going on a little further here, a college education is positively correlated with moral development. Many young people in college go through a time of crisis, sometimes called cognitive disequilibrium, when they leave their home and enter college. They may initially respond to the disruption of their worldviews by conforming to their peer culture. As we've already seen, freshmen tend to be more black and white in their thinking. In a study of moral reasoning in college students were presented with a fictional case of Joe. One day, a neighbor discovers that Joe, who has been living the life of a model citizen for several years, is actually an escaped prisoner. Students are then asked, should the neighbor turn this man in to the authorities? Freshmen were most likely to say yes, and their reason was because that's what the law dictates. This person's a fugitive, so legally speaking, they should be arrested. But by the time college students were in their senior year, they still had concerns with the status of the law, but they also questioned whether it would be fair for the law to be applied in this case. Those at the post-conventional level wanted to know more questions. For example, what was the nature of Joe's crime? Has he been truly rehabilitated? They also asked which action, reporting or not reporting him, would provide the most benefit to society. So peer relations in college are important in the development of moral reasoning. Students who have diverse friendship with people who are different from themselves tend to make greater gains. Discussion of moral issues in classrooms in which student ideas are challenged and they're required to support their conclusions also have potential to enhance moral reasoning. But despite these positive influences, most college students don't make the transition to post-conventional moral reasoning. Instead, college tends to push students up into a higher stage of conventional reasoning, where they shift to conforming to wider social norms instead of just their peers. And level of moral reasoning is positively correlated with self-esteem, mental health, satisfaction with career goals, honesty, and altruistic behavior. And they cite a study in the footnotes that you can look at to get some empirical data on that. Okay, so we've talked about the stages of the moral development and moral reasoning. Now what we're going to go into is something very important, which is a description and discussion of different moral theories. And Gabriel, I know you kind of wanted to talk about this last time because you expressed a little frustration with having just untutored moral intuitions. Like, don't we all kind of generally agree that this is right, that is wrong? Like, what's the basis for the moral decision making? So this might take your interest a little bit. So now there's two main types of moral theory. And what are moral theories? Moral theories are attempts to state principles that allow us to classify actions into the categories right, wrong, or obligatory, impermissible, permissible, or obligatory. So if your question is, what makes an action defined as impermissible or obligatory, we have to consult with these moral theories to give us answers. And moral theories attempt to say what the parameters or principles are that classify the moral status of an action. So there's two main kinds, guys. So two main types of moral theory. Okay, so two main types of moral theory. One second. Okay, so the two main types that we're talking about then are moral relativism and moral universalist theories. So moral relativist theories versus moral universalism theories. So first of all, to the moral relativists, what is moral relativism? Moral relativism basically says morality is not universal and objective, but rather it is relative to something. What that something is, we'll talk about in a moment, but here I'll just define it for us. Okay, so there you see the quick little written definition of moral relativism. The idea that morality is not universal, it's not objective, it's relative. And there are actually two major types of moral relativism that can be further distinguished within this category. But basically, if you're a moral relativist, you think there's no objective fact about what actions or behaviors are right or wrong, that it depends on something that can be different from case to case. So if you're a moral relativist and somebody asks you, is abortion wrong? You might say, well, there's no factual answer to that. There's different opinions on the question, but none of them gets the status of being like the so-called right answer. So if moral relativism is your view, then you think that morality is relative to something, but we'll say what that is just now. Now, there's two types of moral relativism. One version of moral relativism, the most sort of radically subjective of all, is what they call ethical subjectivism. And ethical subjectivism just says this, that morality is nothing more than each person's personal opinion. So okay. So ethical subjectivism. Morality is nothing more than each person's personal opinion. Seeing the diversity of opinions that there can be on any number of moral questions, may lead some to agree with ethical subjectivism. But the thing is, um, even though it has some appeal, because you might say, well, what could possibly be the ground of an objective, universal form of morality? Um, Nonetheless, there's certainly some moral and conceptual problems with the extreme ethical subjectivist view. Can anybody tell me, if you can imagine, what might be a problem with ethical subjectivism? In what ways could this view be perhaps dark and scary, if you really think it through a little bit? How so? Can anybody get to that idea? What about ethical subjectivism might give you pause and make you wonder if there's something maybe a little bit scary and dangerous about it? Yeah, so you say, Gabriel, it validates the socially harmful takes on ethics, right? So let me ask you a question, and see where this goes. Is it wrong, based on ethical subjectivism, to kill an innocent person? Is it wrong or not? It's kind of a trick question, so just consider your answer, but I'm sure you can tell. It does depend on who you ask. Okay, so good, Gabriel. That means that there's no objective fact to the answer to this question. So, killing an innocent person, I guess it would be wrong, but to who? To those who feel like it's wrong. So, to the vast majority of us who find the act abhorrent and would never consider it, it's deeply wrong, and we would say, in that mind, in that person's opinion, and therefore in their moral world, it's wrong. But to whom or in what case is it not wrong? In what scenario under ethical subjectivism is killing innocent person not wrong? Or in what person can we find this different answer? To whom is it not wrong? Or it's only wrong if you think it is. That's right, Gabriel. So say that there's like a serial killer out there, and you're asking them, is killing wrong? And they'll say, no, not at all. It's very fun. It's like hunting, except humans are much more skillful and harder to subdue. But when you are able to take one's life, it's a supreme joy. And therefore, I think it's one of the best things people can do. And it's great. I love it. Now, that's not okay, though. I mean, don't you guys sort of feel like we shouldn't grant legitimacy or justification to such a deviant view? Like, if there's a person who believes that rape is okay, that therefore we can't really say it's wrong. All we can say is, well, some people have the opinion it's wrong, some people have the opinion it's not wrong, and there's no answer, there's no fact that can break the tie between the two sides. Um, so the real issue, therefore, with ethical subjectivism is it doesn't allow us to say that certain things which intuitively are absolutely wrong, it doesn't give us the ability to make a full strength moral claim that it's absolutely wrong. Instead, we're in the weak position of saying that it's wrong to some and not to others. And don't you feel like it's appropriate to claim that such a thing as rape, genocide, torture, killing of innocent people is not just wrong according to some and not others, but that it's absolutely wrong in some kind of deeper objective sense? So that's one issue with ethical subjectivism. It is so subjective that it deprives us of any ability to make a strong moral claim, like that something is actually wrong, or that it's wrong even if there are some people who are deviant and in their misguided thinking have a different view. Okay, like I don't think that we should want to concede the point that, killing a bunch of little school children is just something that an opinion says is wrong, but that it's actually wrong. So there's your ethical subjectivist criticism, that it's not able to generate the kind of moral conclusions that we think are intuitively correct. You could argue you're imposing your morals on others, and that's wrong. Thinking bad things are okay is only bad if you do bad things to others. Um, well, I'm talking about the person that's going to do the killing. I don't know. I mean, how far down the rabbit hole are you trying to go here, Gabriel? I guess I'm not talking about thinking, but I'm talking about the actions. If you think that it's not wrong, then you think the action of doing it's not wrong. Are we getting confused? They're not talking one to another? If a person believes that there's nothing wrong with rape, then when people commit the act of rape, or if they themselves commit the act of rape, the rapist, they think they've done nothing wrong. Maybe they think it was natural, or maybe they think if you go back far enough in prehistory, powerful males had a biological imperative to pass on their genes through such things as rape, that we could define and classify as rape today. But yes, I'm going to try to impose my moral view on you and everybody that rape is wrong and that it's not just my opinion, that it's a fact. Don't you have a tendency to agree with that? I mean, it's an example. You go into a generality, you say bad things, but I'm giving specific examples. Torturing in the military, several practices on military are so severe. I would say that's actually wrong too. I have no problem saying that's wrong, even though it's a practice that has happened and in some cases does exist. Um, but all we're talking about here are the debate between different rival theories. Ethical subjectivism has its critics. I'm trying to get you to understand the criticism, whether or not I am an ethical subjectivist or not. Yeah, so the critique is that some people believe there's real objectivity in ethics. There's objectivity in ethics, and some people can be wrong about their moral views. Like the person who believes in murder is wrong, and the person who believes that it's not okay to murder is correct. If that's something that sounds reasonable, then you can't be a straight up ethical subjectivist because all you can say is there's a consensus of opinion that it's wrong. But to those who have a different view, it's not wrong to them. Doesn't that sound bad to you? You don't get that feeling? Well, you're probably in the conventional stage of moral reasoning anyway, then, because you think, it's just about what the rules are. And most people agree on these rules, so that's all there is. But anyway, yeah, let's keep going. So, another type of relativism that maybe doesn't suffer from exactly the same problems as ethical subjectivism, but similar problems, is cultural relativism. So, this is the second version of moral relativism to add to our notes. It's cultural relativism. Cultural relativism, as I'm sure you can guess, is the idea that morality depends on the norms and standards of one's culture or society. Okay, cultural relativism. So now, cultural relativism, there's still relativity, but it's located not at the level of the individual, but rather at the level of the culture or society in which the individual resides. So it might not suffer from exactly the same problems, but we'll get to what its problems may be. Um, so here's a new question, I guess. Let me ask, in cultural relativism, is killing an innocent person wrong? So it's about the cultural standard. Well, okay, let's talk about our culture. Yes, there have been human sacrifices, and I was about to mention that. But in our own culture, of course, it's definitely wrong. It's one of the most gravely punishable offenses in our law. So, are there some serial killers in our culture that probably disagree with that cultural standard? Sure. But they don't get to determine what morality is because it's the culture, the society as a whole, who's the unit that defines the moral principles in this view about morality. So we don't get the problem anymore that if there's like one rapist in a society that penalizes and condemns rape, that it's right in their view. Instead, it's just wrong, period, but relative to the whole culture rather than relative to the one individual. So it doesn't grant legitimacy to individuals who are deviant within a culture because the cultural norm prevails and sets the determination of what the moral standard is. But there are still problems with cultural relativism that could be pointed out. And what do you think those could be? What could be the problem with cultural relativism now? Maybe I'll let you say it. So I'm not putting words in anyone's mouth. What could be the problem with cultural relativism, if any? And so slavery was mainstream for a while, sure. Now that's an example, but the conceptual point behind the example is that if cultural relativism is true, then we would not be able to make critiques of whole cultures that engage in practices that are intuitively unethical. So, question: is it wrong to have a child bride? Is it wrong for little girls to be married off to older men? Um, it depends on the culture. I'm sure you're aware of the kind of response I'm asking for. And so, in our culture, of course, we would say that it's wrong because it's illegal and it's a taboo and it's definitely something that we find to be sick, disgusting, whatever. But there are cultures that have and still maybe exist in some parts of the world where it's not only not considered wrong, but it is considered like an expected rite of passage. Um, Now, do we want to be able to say that that's wrong, or do we just have to say that, oh, well, in our culture it's wrong, but in their culture it's not wrong, and there's just no answer as to what standard is the right one? Um, and there you go, right, Armand. The problem is the consensus is again just conventional. Um, don't we want to say that like child sacrifice is wrong? I mean, there can be cases in which, and yes, you talk about Mormon fundamentalists marrying 14-year-old children. I'm not sure what the legal status of that is under the state or federal laws. I know that the age of consent is different in some different states, but I didn't know that it went as far down as 14. Anyway, though, you can fact check it at any time. But yeah, I know that states have different rules in some cases. Let's not make the case too complicated for me to present the idea. The idea is simply this, that of course two different cultures can stand opposed in terms of what they think is a right or wrong practice. But do we want to really have to limit ourselves to the weak sounding judgment that there's no fact of the matter here? So in one culture, maybe women are not allowed any liberty or emancipation, and in another they are. Do we just want to say, well, the status of women, it's really no fact of the matter whether they should be at liberty or not? Some cultures believe in it, others don't. So the problem with cultural relativism is it denies you the ability to make a critique of a whole culture, to say this culture is bad or they're backwards or what they do is wrong over there. Instead, all you have to do is sort of state, like respectfully, that they just have different moral assumptions than us, as if there's no validity to the superiority of a moral judgment in one culture versus another. And in the book Underneath the Banner of Heaven, yes, you know what? I've heard of the book. So now that I've heard of the book, I guess I can connect it to your anecdote in the book. Cannibalism, there you go, Catherine. I suppose so, right? Cannibalism. I can't think of anything that would probably be more disgusting in my view. But have there ever been, or are there perhaps individual cultures that practice it? I'm not hugely knowledgeable about all these anthropological matters, but I know that it's something that has existed, and it wouldn't be surprised to find that it's somewhere in the world still. But do we want to grant legitimacy to a culture who practices this just because it's their shared assumption? If there are cultures, you give the case, Kelvin, hunting dogs for meat, sure. In our culture, this is deeply wrong. We think of dogs as companion animals, pets. Although I would say this one is a little less easy for me to discharge because we do harm a lot of other animals that have a high degree of intelligence, like pigs. So I'm not 100% sure whether the cultural standard we have is 100% consistent on the point of whether dogs should be treated this way, but I tend to agree. Anyway, then, so look, we've talked about two forms of relativism, the ethical subjectivist, the cultural relativist. Both can be criticized from the standpoint that isn't there something that's objectively wrong, though? Neither one says that that's true. The most we can say in ethical subjectivism is that one person or maybe a lot of people feel the same way that something is wrong. And the most that we can say in cultural relativism is that the culture or society has set forth a common standard that recognizes that as wrong, but none of those cultures can claim to be the one that's so-called right. Okay, yeah, I guess, Catherine, you are what you eat, not hopefully another person, though. Okay, so turning the page, there is religious relativism, sure. Like there are different religions all around the world, and some people take their moral guidance from what they think religion requires them to do. So I guess that can be one thing that plays into this whole discussion of different relativistic systems. Yes, there's religious relativism. Whether that's a moral relativism, though, I guess depends on how closely one associates their religious views with their moral views. People can still be stoned to death, yes. I mean, look, gay people can be executed in certain African nations. In our country, this would be murder, and it would be a violation of their civil rights. Is it okay in those countries where that's happening? Do you just want to say, well, they have a different definition of right and wrong? They say that it's totally wrong, therefore it's a death penalty offense. We don't say that, and live and let live. We both have our own different opinions. I mean, I know I'm talking to a lot of people that are in their college age, and we've had it drilled into us over and over again that tolerance means respect. But it's not the same thing as tolerance when you're willing to accept injustice. So I find that there's a saying, have an open mind, but not so open that your brain just falls right out. There's still some things that are objective truths. Maybe ethics isn't the place where people think they will find them, but I feel that sometimes, to the contrary, too much relativistic thinking makes a person incapable of making any kind of serious judgments because nothing matters at a certain level if everything's relative. Okay, So let's go then to the other side. If either of these types of relativism don't seem to go far enough, or you feel some favor with the criticisms, then we got to take a good look at the other side, which are moral universalist theories. Moral universalist theories say something much different. So, moral universalism. What moral universalism claims is that morality is universal and it's objective. It's not subjective, it's objective. And therefore, if that's true, then there's a universal moral code that doesn't change, that is the same for all people, all places, and all times. So it's not different from culture to culture, person to person, or from generation to generation. There's one universal moral code, and it's binding on all people everywhere in the same exact way. So moral universalism says morality is objective and universal. Okay, moral universalism. Morality is objective, universal. There's a universal objective moral code that applies to all people, places, and times. So, according to this view, there may be disagreement over morality, but there's only one moral fact. Um, and there have been actually different systems of moral universalist theory that have been developed and highly articulated in the West. There's two major ones, and those are the two big ones that I'm going to try and help you understand in the rest of today's meeting, and then also for some part of Tuesday when we come back. Um, and I would say this in academic study and discussion of morality and ethics, the prevailing consensus is that that moral universalism is true. So folk wisdom, I think, of a lot of people is that it's some relativism is true. But academics who talk about it have much more affinity with moral universalism. Just so you know, that's kind of the intellectual landscape in the literature on ethics. So I want to try and help you understand at least one of them today in part, because I know we won't get through all of it. But one important universalist moral theory is the theory which is called utilitarianism. Okay, utilitarianism. This is one of our universal moral theories. And there's a couple of key figures behind the development of utilitarian ethics, but the one that I think is probably the prominent, most important figure is this man whose name is John Stuart Mill. So John Stuart Mill, he lived from 1806 to 1873, and I'm just going to tell you a couple of brief things about his biography. As you can see, he lived in the 19th century. He was a British philosopher and a political economist, and he was also briefly a member of the British Parliament. So for a short time in his life, he was also a lawmaker and a politician. He would be what we would regard today as a sort of like libertarian in his political philosophy, meaning that he believed in the idea of like limited government. He thought that the government should have the least power that is necessary for it to maintain social order, but no more than that. And he would have been a person who says, for example, that if someone wants to engage in self-regarding conduct, even if it's perhaps self-destructive, they should be given the liberty and freedom to do that as long as it doesn't interfere with the material interests of anybody else. So like for Mill, if a person wanted to drink alcohol, take drugs, gamble, seek prostitution, then they should be given the freedom to do that because those actions don't disadvantage or harm the interests of other people in any direct way. But he also was a person who would be considered a progressive in certain ways relative to the time that he lived, because he believed during a time when women weren't allowed to vote in most Western nations that emancipation of women around the world, women's suffrage was important. He also believed that slavery should be abolished worldwide during a time where it was still existing in certain Western countries. So he had an interesting mixture of views, but he's most well known for his writings in ethics, including his discussion of this theory, utilitarianism, which he's kind of a big pioneer of. So utilitarianism. first thing I'll tell you about it is that it's a member of a family of theories which are called consequentialist moral theories. So we got to take a step back, talk about what is consequentialism, and then we'll be able to use that to further break down and analyze utilitarianism. So here's consequentialism. So consequentialism is this view. It's the view that the moral status of an action, the morality of an action, depends on the consequences that result from the action. Okay. Okay. Consequentialism. What it says is the morality of an action does depend on the consequences that result from it. So consequences are just like the after effects from stuff that you do. And consequences can be good or they can be bad, just depends on the example. If I help my friend study for an exam and then he does well, then me helping him had a positive consequence, his better performance on the test. Or maybe if I get the same friend really drunk before the test, then that has a negative consequence that he doesn't perform so well on the same exam. So the consequentialist is telling you that before you act, you should always engage in this forward-looking prospective judgment about the consequences that are likely to result from whatever you're doing, and that you should in some way act towards the good consequences, act in a way that will produce or result in good positive consequences. So now, looking for my little, oh, here we go. Sometimes I like to just give a diagram of this concept to make it easier to remember maybe. And so suppose that we're talking about consequentialism and we want to have a sense of what it's all about. Now, this is not exactly a great work of art, but suppose this is a person and they perform an action and then like some time passes, which is symbolized by this arrow. At some point after their action is taken, consequences materialize, which is what I'm using the letter C highlighted by these dashes to stand for. So it is these things that matter most to consequentialists when you're making ethical choices. You should always have a view towards what the probable outcomes are from what you're doing and try and act in the way that creates good consequences. So now let me return back to utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is one member of the consequentialist family of theories. So as an example, you can say that mammal is a broader concept than human being, because human being is one species of mammal, but there are many others, other animals that give live birth and have warm blood, like lions, tigers, bears, cats, and dogs, and all those. So if mammal is the umbrella term and the species that fall under it are the examples of it, then in similar terms, consequentialism is an umbrella term, and underneath it, different ethical theories fall, one of them being utilitarianism. So utilitarianism is a member of the consequentialist family. And the utilitarians say that the specific consequences that matter for morality are those that bear on overall human happiness. So the basic motto and creed of utilitarians is this. Now we can finally say. Utilitarianism says, act always to promote the greatest amount of overall happiness for the greatest number of people. So if you wanted to abide by this moral theory and do the so-called right thing, the morally obligatory thing, then you would have to act in whatever way is going to create the most overall happiness for the greatest number of people. So as a utilitarian, here's how you would operate. Whenever you have choices to make, say you have like 4 different options and you just don't know which one's the right one, they would advise you to do this. They would say, take a good estimation of how much total happiness would be the byproduct of each of these options, and then just act in accordance with whichever one would generate the most overall yield of happiness. So you would always kind of have to be gaming out each scenario anticipating in advance how much happiness would each one produce for all affected, and then whichever one you think would create the most, that would be your moral obligation then. So the morally obligatory acts would be those that, as some say, are optimific, the ones that generate the most utility or happiness for the greatest number. Um, and why accept the utilitarian theory? Mill gives us reasons. He tries to give us principles that provide a basis of justification or support for this. So one of the things that he says to defend utilitarianism is what he calls the greatest happiness principle, which is a little, yes, it's been used in film and a lot of fiction as well, explorations of utilitarian ethics, and that's interesting to know too. Let me show you the greatest happiness principle. So the greatest happiness principle says that actions are right morally to the extent that they produce happiness, and actions are wrong to the extent that they produce the reverse of happiness. Okay, so here we go. Greatest happiness principle, GHP. Actions are right insofar to the degree that they promote happiness, and actions are morally wrong to the degree that they do the opposite, which is to promote the reverse. Now, we may be sitting here wondering what exactly is meant by happiness. It's such an abstract, vague concept. Is there any more definite meaning? Yes. Actually, utilitarians have a more specific idea of what the word happiness refers to. And so for them, it's this. Happiness equals pleasure and the absence of pain. Okay, that's happiness. Pleasure in the absence of pain. So if that's what happiness is, I'm betting that someone here can just even guess or deduce what the reverse of happiness would be. It's a definition that's just stated in the contrary terms. So if happiness is pleasure in the absence of pain, then the reverse of happiness would be what and what? Let's see somebody if you can figure that one out. So based off happiness being defined as pleasure in the absence of pain, the reverse of that would be something and something, which is what? Just flipping them around, kind of. Pain in the absence of pleasure. Very good, yes. Pain and the absence of pleasure. Okay, good. So now, when Mill and other utilitarians say that it's our moral duty to act in the way that creates the most happiness, and it's our moral duty to not try and engage in actions that promote the reverse, that is saying that with all your actions, you should have a view towards maximizing total pleasure for as many humans as possible and not causing pain. And bad things that you do are to cause pain or to take pleasure away. So what in the case of masochism and sadism? Very good question, Kay. Yes. So some people may actually find pleasure in pain. And in that case, it doesn't count as the kind of pain that is the reverse of happiness. It's sometimes referred to as preference-based assignment of pleasures and pains. So we cannot say without knowing the individual's preference which out of two experiences is more pleasurable for them. So if you had, like, say, a masochist who likes, I don't know, being like whipped sexually or something because it causes certain pain, but they like the enjoyment of the pain, then in that case, the person's preference for the act qualifies it as a source of pleasure for them. But anyway, to the extent that we do things that create happiness, we usually regard those actions as good. If somebody, let's say, prevents a person's death by rushing into a burning building, we think they did a great thing because not only did they prevent them from the inevitable pains that would have had come from burning to death, but also all the future pleasure they ever would have experienced afterwards would have been canceled had they not been rescued. So that's a very noble and good act. It allows the continuation of whatever happiness that they are capable of, and prevents them from having that horrible, painful experience in the short term too. Now, if they saved one person, would say they did a good thing. If they saved 2, 5, 10, it's getting better and better. So it's a matter of degree. That's what it says when it says to the extent that. So actions could be better and better when they promote more and more happiness or take more and more pain away. On the other hand, who do we think of as bad people? People who cause people pain or remove their happiness. So if I'm the arsonist who set fire to the house and one person was consumed in the flames, I've done a very bad thing because I've made their end of life painful, plus I deprive them of all future pleasure. And then there's the associated pains, psychologically, emotionally, and otherwise, of all their friends and loved ones that will now have to deal with the grief. If I did that in the case of one person, that would be a bad thing. But if I did it to 5, 10, if I'm starting to commit genocide, it's just getting worse and worse and worse. So he thinks that that's totally intuitive moral common sense. And to further reinforce that claim, there's yet another principle that I'm going to write here in the chat. But let me see your question, Kelvin. So all presidents are utilitarians because they're providing greatest happiness to a whole country. Well, I don't know, Kelvin. It does depend. Because the president, you can have a president that leads the country in a bad direction, and therefore makes it worse. You can have presidents that start wars, that kill a lot of American citizens or kill people abroad. But in the general case, you would hope that a person with great power would be able to use that position to engineer more and more happiness for all members of society. After all, that should be what they would want to do, you'd think. Gabriel, you say, which one has more value? Slavery gives some pleasure and gives some pain, but so does masochism. Well, slavery causes a lot of pain to the slave. It deprives them of their freedom, and so it's extremely harmful. And the things achievable through slavery can be achieved without that pain. And so therefore, since there's a substitution, like mechanized automated work or people doing the labor as free citizens getting compensated, since there are more humane alternatives to achieving the same goals, there's no reason for a utilitarian to prefer slavery. But at the same time, I want to take your question seriously. It's possible for a person to form a moral argument that the pain suffered by slaves is overwhelmed by the benefits to the majority of society from the results of slave labor. And for reasons like that, some people don't agree with utilitarian theory. But it's not that the utilitarian is forced to concede the point. They just have to make a different evaluation of the balance of pleasures and pains. And I would say reasonably, they would probably point out that a society which has slavery is less overall happy than one that doesn't, because the pain of the slaves has to be counted as a counterweight towards total human happiness. It's not like only the happiness and pain of the free citizens matters, because it's human happiness that's the subject of the moral theory. Do you mean just for the people who aren't slaves rather than the slaves themselves? So I'm talking about both cases. The slave suffers by being a slave, obviously. The people that might benefit from the results of slave labor could be called beneficiaries who gain some measure of happiness. But how could it possibly be outweighed by a counterfactual situation where the same results are derived not through slave labor, which causes misery and unhappiness? And Gabriel over here, he's saying, don't always act in the best interest of the population. People can vote against their own interests, and that's also true. Yes, obviously so. Let me add one more point here, guys, why the plausibility of the theory is there. He adds this claim to give us further reinforcement. It's this claim. Happiness, and since happiness and pleasure are like synonymous to them, I'll put a slash. Happiness / pleasure is the only thing that we pursue as humans, that we pursue as an end and not as a means. So if you ask John Stuart Mill, why should I agree with you? Why should I buy into this? Why is happiness this important goal that you put at the centerpiece of the theory? He would say this. He'd say, well, one reason is because happiness and pleasure is the one and only thing that we're pursuing as an end and not as a means. Now, for us to fully understand that claim or statement, we have to think a bit about the meaning of those words, means and ends. So I'm going to try and help you get there with a little question about a common phrase that some of us have heard. Has anybody ever heard the statement or phrase, the ends sometimes justify the means? If you have, let me know. Okay, good. So Armand or anybody else, if a person says that the ends justify the means, what are they saying? Can you tell me in other words, in a more full way, what that is actually claiming? The ends justify the means. Huh? What does it mean? What does that mean? Can you tell me? The consequence justifies the action getting to it. Okay, good. I think that's a fair way to put it, Armand, right? So tell me then, what would be an end specifically? Just breaking that part out of the statement. An end, in other words, is a what? It's a goal. It's getting to a goal or an objective that you have. So that's very right. Yes. End. Ends are just goals or objectives. And that's also fair, John. The actions are okay because the results are good. So ends are goals or objectives. And now, what is a means then? Since you've said, Armand, and also you, John, that when one claims ends justify the means, they mean that like the consequence justifies the action that you took to get there, or the actions are okay because the results are good. The end would be the result or the desired outcome, the goal. What would be means? What are means in relation to ends? Means are just the things that what? Let me know. What do you think it means to say, well, what is a means? It's something that causes the outcome? Okay, good. Yes, they are the actions that a person takes or the methods that they then use to achieve the goals they have, whatever those goals are. Okay, so let me write that. Means. Okay. So you say collectivist hedonism, Gabriel? Well, hedonism is individualistic. Hedonism is another form of consequentialism. So it's a sharp point that you're making. With hedonism, the moral standard is this: the right action is whichever action generates the most pleasure for me, the individual who's committing the action. So in hedonism, if you like something the best, even if it makes everyone else unhappy, then you should go ahead and do it. So hedonism is usually relegated to the sidelines and margins of serious moral theory because it sounds like counterintuitive to the concept of ethics, because it's like an open invitation to just live a selfish life where you're unconcerned with anyone else's interests and merely concerned with yourself. In fact, many people live that way, but ethics is supposed to be how you ought to live, ideally, if you were morally enlightened, not about how people have a tendency to act anyway, regardless of whether they've ever had any moral intuitions or instruction. Um, but, you know, it's, I guess technically you could say collective hedonism, but it's a weird sort of oxymoronic use of the word because hedonism is not collective. Hedonism is essentially individualistic. So the common bond between the two, though, that I think you're identifying and that you are putting your finger on, is that they are both concerned with maximization of pleasure, but to whom? In hedonism, it's maximization of pleasure to the one individual, the actor. And in utilitarianism, it's not about the individual, and so it's really not proper to say it's hedonistic because in utilitarianism, you might have to make large sacrifices in many cases to do the thing that's going to generate the most happiness for everybody. We'll talk about exact scenarios to follow. Well, that's what I'm going to start with on Tuesday. Like, here's a scenario where everyone's got to choose pizza toppings, and you'll see how, like, maybe one person that's not going to get their favorite choice still has to accept it because it's what's going to create the most happiness for the whole group. If you're the hedonistic person, though, you would break away from the group the second they wanted to do something that was outside your particular interests. Okay, but back to the claim here, means and ends. Ends are goals. Means are things that you do to get to those goals. So like, for example, right now you guys, I think, have a goal, an end of graduating college. Why else would you be a student here? And one of the means that you're taking towards that end is taking this class. Or suppose that a person has a goal of becoming fit. Maybe the means that they take towards that are like, I don't know, going to the gym, going on runs, and things of that kind. Those are the actions they take to get to the goal they're looking for. When a person says ends justify the means, what they're saying is that if you have an important enough goal or objective, then it can justify the things that you had to do to get there, even if maybe sometimes those actions that you took as means were considered on their own a little bit unsavory. So like maybe a person said, I stole a loaf of bread, and theft is generally wrong, but in this case, I did it to feed like my starving daughter, and I had no other means to do it, and therefore, you know, the ends saving my daughter's life, that justifies the means of theft. For our purposes, though, let's return to Mill's claim. Mill says that the only thing that we pursue as an end in our whole life as humans is pleasure and happiness. Nothing else is the goal. So, in other words, the only goal of everything is happiness and pleasure. Everything else that you want, if you want it, is not desired for its own sake. It's desired as a means towards the attainment of happiness, which is your real goal. So, like, for example, right now, to make this relatable to you, you're watching a lecture and you're doing it for just you're not doing it for no reason. This class is a means for you towards something else. So, what is the reason you're taking it? Why are you even here? I would say probably it's because you want to get a good grade in the class. You attend the class as a means to doing well in it. Why do you want to do well in the class? That's not desired for its own sake either, per se. You want to do well in this class as a means towards, I'm thinking, filling out certain general education requirements, probably getting towards transferring. So let's take it slow. You attend as a means to getting good grade in it. You want a good grade in it as a means towards transfer. Why do you want to transfer, though? That's a means to another end. That's a means towards graduation. So you want to graduate. But why do you want to graduate? Again, that's a means to some other end. It's not like you just want to hold the degree and look at it as a piece of art when you're standing up there in your cap and gown, and then you're like, I don't have any other goals. This is it. No, you want the degree, I know it, but it's a means to what? Why do you want to get a degree? I'm assuming you do. But why? What's the end that you're seeking? Money. Okay. Well, you took one step, you leaped past just one little step, which is that you want to get the degree in order to get some kind of career or job. But why do you want the career or job? I know it's not that you just want labor for its own sake. You want the job, but you want the job as a means towards the attainment of money, income. Well, there's one more question I can ask. Why do you want money? What's it a means to? It's a means towards purchasing power over goods and services and also financial security. So why do you want to have purchasing power? And why do you want to have financial security? Why do you want that? Why do you want that? You want money, right? Why? You want to be able to buy things, but why do you want to be able to? We've got to the last thing. So you say, so I can keep doing my thing in this society? It's a little too vague, I'm sorry to say. To live happily, yeah, you're doing it all because you want to be happy. And if I ask you, why do you want happiness? It's okay then to sort of just shrug your shoulders and be like, I don't know, that's just a basic fact of the human condition. I just want happiness because happiness is what we all seek. John, freedom, well, happiness. I mean, if you didn't think freedom would make you happy, I'm sure you'd rather have people run your life for you. But you want freedom if you want it because you think it's happy to be free. So everything we're doing is drawn towards the goal in the end of happiness. You wouldn't continue your studies right now if I could convince you that this is going to make you miserable in the end, give you a bunch of debt, and you'll never have a job. You don't believe that. You believe that it's for your sake of happiness that you continue to do these things. And it's like that with everything. If you want to get married, have children, start a business, it's because you think those things will make you happy. So, according to Mill, if happiness is what each one pursues, then it's the supreme goal of all human effort and striving. So why not reasonably make that the standard and the North Star principle of an ethical system? You want happiness, I want it, so does everybody else. We don't all find happiness in the exact same places, but that doesn't mean that we disagree about the general goal of being happy and pleased. And now, Gabriel, you say this. I believe the means is the end in life. I want both a job for money, but also I'd be miserable if I didn't have a rock to push up a hill. Well, that's you, Gabriel. I don't know. Me, I would love to just lay in a field, looking at the clouds, chilling, not doing nothing, and just enjoying my existence and not having to labor. But everyone's different. Anyway, guys, I'll see you guys on Tuesday. We've run out of time for the moment, but we're doing well, and we will finish up the rest of our notes on Chapter 9 when we come back. So don't forget that you've got that homework that's due next Thursday, and I will be done over the weekend with your most recent assignments, so you should be all good, and you can check with me once I'm done. I'll send an announcement. Okay, then, thanks, everybody. I'm going to let you go. Take it easy, and if you need anything, be in touch. I'll send the link to the office hours also that are at 4 in case anybody wants to go. Okay, thank you then. Have a great one. Bye-bye. When is our final, John? It's Thursday, December the 16th. It's the last day of class, so it's 2 weeks from today. 2 weeks from today, you're taking your final. Okay, see you guys. Thanks again.